For days, it looked like Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney were finally moving toward a trade agreement. Trump even announced that the two countries had a deal in progress. Then, almost at the last moment, the negotiations collapsed, and Carney is now explaining why. According to the Canadian Prime Minister, Washington's final demands went beyond tariffs. They touched some of Canada's most sensitive economic and political interests, including automobiles, Canada's ability to make trade agreements with other countries, cultural and language protections, and access to critical minerals. Canada walked away. The United States imposed new 50% tariffs, and Ottawa is preparing a dollar-for-dollar response beginning September 8th. So what exactly did Washington ask for? And why did Carney decide that accepting the deal would be worse than walking away? That's where this story gets much more complicated. Just days ago, the situation looked completely different. After months of escalating tariff threats, Trump announced that the United States and Canada had made significant progress. On August 18th, Trump delayed the planned tariffs for 3 days, saying there was a deal in progress. Carney also acknowledged that substantial progress had been made. That created the possibility of something neither side had been able to achieve for months, a broader agreement that could reduce tariffs and provide businesses with more certainty. But there was an important difference between saying a deal was close and actually having a finalized agreement. The negotiations continued, and behind the scenes, some of the most difficult issues were still unresolved. Canada wanted tariff relief for major industries. Ottawa also wanted stability, not another temporary arrangement that could be changed weeks or months later. The United States, meanwhile, was demanding better access for American businesses and stronger commitments from Canada. Then came the final round. And according to Carney, the American position changed in ways Canada could not accept. In his August 22nd remarks, Carney said Canada's negotiators had been working toward an agreement that would protect Canadian workers, reduce tariffs, and preserve Canada's ability to make independent economic decisions. But he said the latest American terms were uneconomic and unfair. And that's when the negotiations went from difficult to fundamentally different. Because the dispute was no longer simply about how high a tariff should be. It became a question of what Canada would have to give up in exchange for tariff relief. The first major flashpoint: autos. The automobile industry became one of the most important pressure points. Canada and the United States have deeply integrated auto supply chains. A vehicle can cross the border multiple times before it reaches the consumer. So when tariffs change, the impact isn't limited to one company or one country. It can affect factories, suppliers, transportation companies, and ultimately consumers. Carney said the final U.S. position on autos did not provide what Canada considered economically sustainable terms. According to reporting on Carney's post-negotiation comments, the disagreement involved the level of tariffs and the treatment of Canadian content. That distinction matters. Canada wasn't simply asking for a symbolic reduction. Ottawa wanted an arrangement that would allow Canadian auto production to remain economically viable over time. Carney argued that some of the proposed restrictions could eventually make Canadian production uneconomic. And this is where the negotiation became much more consequential. Because Canada could potentially accept painful tariffs temporarily, but accepting terms that undermine one of its core industrial sectors would have a much longer-term impact. The United States has argued that its proposed agreement would have offered Canada significant tariff reductions in areas including autos, steel, aluminum, and lumber. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said Canada ultimately declined to finalize the terms Washington believed had been agreed earlier in the week. So there are two competing versions of what happened. Washington says Canada pulled back from commitments. Ottawa says the United States changed the terms and demanded too much. That disagreement is important because it tells us something about what happens next. Neither side currently believes it was the party responsible for killing the deal. And that makes a quick resolution much harder. Then came the issue of Canada's other trade partners. But the auto dispute was only one part of the problem. There was another demand that goes directly to Canada's economic independence. Carney said the United States sought language that would restrict Canada's ability to make trade agreements with other countries. That is a major issue. Think about what Canada is trying to do right now. Ottawa has been actively diversifying its trade relationships so that Canadian businesses are not overwhelmingly dependent on the American market. Carney said Canada already has preferential access to roughly 1.5 billion consumers through existing trade agreements and is working to expand that reach. So from Canada's perspective, agreeing to restrictions on future trade relationships could defeat one of the central strategies it has been pursuing. Instead of simply asking Canada to sell more to America, the proposed terms could have limited where Canada could look for future economic opportunities, and that's a very different kind of demand. Carney has repeatedly argued that Canada needs the flexibility to build partnerships around the world: the European Union, India, ASEAN, the Gulf, other major economies. For Ottawa, diversification isn't just an economic slogan anymore. It has become part of the country's response to the uncertainty surrounding the U.S. market. And that explains why this particular issue became so sensitive. Canada was being asked to negotiate better access to the United States while potentially giving up some freedom to expand access elsewhere. From Carney's perspective, that was not simply a trade concession. It was a question of sovereignty and long-term economic strategy. And there was still another issue on the table, one involving resources that have become strategically important to the United States itself. Critical minerals, the resource card Canada refused to give away. Canada has something Washington increasingly wants: critical minerals. These materials are important for advanced manufacturing, batteries, electronics, energy technologies, and national security supply chains. That makes Canadian mineral resources strategically valuable. During the negotiations, there were reports that the United States wanted preferential or exclusive access to Canadian critical minerals. Carney was asked about that directly. His response was clear: Canada would not give the United States exclusive access. But here's the important distinction. Carney did not say Canada was unwilling to cooperate with America. Quite the opposite. He described critical minerals as an area where Canada and the United States could potentially cooperate with each other and with other allies. The disagreement was over exclusivity. Canada wants the ability to sell its resources to multiple partners, and from Ottawa's perspective, that flexibility has increasing value because countries around the world are looking for secure supplies of strategically important minerals. So why give one country exclusive access when Canada can potentially negotiate with several? That's the logic behind Carney's position. But for Washington, critical minerals are not just another commodity. The United States wants reliable supply chains that are less dependent on geopolitical rivals. That creates an obvious strategic incentive for Washington to secure closer access to Canadian resources. And that's why the mineral issue could become one of the biggest subjects in future negotiations. The irony is that both countries have a reason to cooperate. Canada has the resources. America has enormous industrial demand. A partnership could benefit both. But the negotiations showed how quickly cooperation can become competition when the terms involve control, exclusivity, and leverage. And then the dispute moved into territory that was even more politically sensitive: Canada's culture and French language. This part of the dispute is easy to overlook if you only look at the tariff numbers, but for Canada, it was central. Carney said Canada would not compromise its protections for culture and the French language. According to his remarks, American proposals affecting Canadian cultural policy and language protections were among the issues that became unacceptable to Ottawa. This wasn't about whether Canada wanted better tariff treatment. It was about what Canada would be required to change internally in order to get that treatment. And that distinction explains why Carney chose to walk away. His government had already made concessions during the negotiations. Canada had offered to remove remaining retaliatory tariffs on certain strategic sectors if the United States significantly reduced its own tariffs. Ottawa also indicated it could encourage provinces to restore American alcohol products to store shelves, and Canada was willing to take administrative measures related to its supply management system. But Carney said some things were simply not on the table: culture, language, and Canadian sovereignty. That is the line his government ultimately drew. And this is where the story takes a different turn. Because the immediate economic question is, would accepting the deal have been worth it? But the longer-term political question is, what happens when a country believes that every concession produces another demand? Carney's argument is that Canada has spent more than a year trying to find a workable compromise, while the American position continued to shift. The United States has a different interpretation. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said Canada introduced new demands and walked back commitments after Washington had already offered substantial tariff reductions. So viewers should be careful here. The public record establishes that the two sides disagree sharply about who changed the terms and when. It does not establish that one side's entire account is independently proven. What is undeniable is the result. The deal collapsed, and the tariffs arrived. The tariffs are now real, and Canada is responding. On August 22nd, the United States implemented new 50% tariffs on a range of Canadian goods. The affected products include items such as hockey equipment, clothing, cement, beer, and other manufactured and consumer goods. Some major categories, including energy, remain outside these particular tariffs. The scale of the affected trade is significant, although published estimates differ depending on which tariff categories are counted. Carney's government has now decided to respond. Canada says it will match the new tariffs dollar for dollar. The Canadian measures are scheduled to take effect on September 8th, the Tuesday after Labor Day. Ottawa says the response will focus on sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. And there is another important point. Carney openly acknowledged that retaliation has a cost. Tariffs do not simply hurt foreign companies. They can increase costs for businesses and consumers on the country imposing them as well. That is why Canada says it is taking these measures reluctantly. But Ottawa's argument is that doing nothing could leave Canadian industries exposed to American competition without adequate protection. So Canada is essentially making a calculation. Absorb the pain of retaliation now, while trying to protect domestic industries and diversify trade, or accept American terms that Ottawa believes could weaken its economic position over the long term. Neither option is painless. And that is the reality behind the headlines. This is not a simple story where one side wins and the other side loses. There are businesses on both sides that depend on cross-border trade. There are workers who depend on integrated supply chains. And there are consumers who can ultimately feel the effects through higher prices and fewer choices. The longer the dispute continues, the harder it becomes to separate the economic relationship from the political relationship. So where does this leave Trump and Carney? For now, the negotiations are suspended. Canada has recalled its negotiating team. The new American tariffs are already in place. Canada's countermeasures are scheduled for September 8th, and there is no guarantee that the two governments will immediately return to the same negotiating table. But this does not necessarily mean the relationship is permanently broken. The economic ties between the United States and Canada are simply too large. Canada is one of America's most important trading partners. The United States remains Canada's largest export market. American consumers depend on Canadian energy and other products. Canadian consumers buy enormous quantities of American goods and services, and thousands of businesses operate across the border. So eventually, both governments have incentives to find some kind of workable arrangement. The question is what that arrangement will look like. Will Washington return with a narrower set of demands? Will Ottawa be willing to make additional concessions? Can both countries create a system that gives businesses enough certainty to invest? And perhaps most importantly, can they negotiate without turning every trade discussion into a broader dispute over sovereignty? That's the unresolved question. Carney is betting that Canada can withstand the pressure long enough to diversify its economy. His government says Canada is expanding trade relationships, investing in infrastructure, supporting affected businesses, and building new economic partnerships. Ottawa says more than $25 billion has already been committed to support workers and businesses affected by tariffs. But diversification takes time. American trade is already deeply embedded in the Canadian economy. So the real test won't be the political speeches. It will be whether Canadian businesses can survive the transition without major job losses, investment declines, or prolonged price increases. And that is something we will only know over the coming months. The biggest development here isn't simply that Trump imposed another tariff, and it isn't simply that Carney retaliated. The bigger story is that the two countries appear to have reached a point where the definition of a good trade deal is completely different on each side. Washington wants greater access, stronger commitments, and economic terms that prioritize American interests. Ottawa wants tariff relief too, but says it will not trade away its sovereignty, cultural protections, freedom to make other trade agreements, or exclusive control over its strategic resources. That is why the final negotiations became so difficult. Carney's message is essentially this: Canada wants a deal, but not every deal is worth signing. And that distinction could shape the next phase of the US-Canada relationship. The immediate question is, what happens on September 8th, when Canada's retaliatory tariffs take effect? The bigger question is whether these measures push both sides back toward negotiation, or whether the dispute becomes a longer-term restructuring of North American trade. For now, the answer isn't clear. But one thing is, the relationship between the United States and Canada is entering a new economic reality, and the decisions made in the next few weeks could determine how that relationship works for years. If you want to follow how this trade dispute develops, especially what happens when Canada's counter tariffs take effect, stay with the story, because the next negotiation may be even more consequential than the one that just collapsed.